Setting the scene. Winter in the Civil War. Close your eyes and picture this. It's the middle of the 1860s, and you're a soldier in the American Civil War. You're not charging bravely into battle, or waving a flag on some glorious hilltop. Nope. Right now, you're just cold. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. Forget the enemy's bullets tonight. It's the freezing wind that's your greatest threat. The Civil War didn't stop for bad weather. Soldiers fought, marched, and camped in every season. But winter was its own kind of battlefield. From Virginia's snowy fields to Tennessee's icy rain, thousands of men had to endure months of bitter cold without the comforts we take for granted today. No electric blankets, no insulated coats, not even proper boots for many of them. Just thin tents, worn-out wool uniforms, and whatever scraps they could scavenge. The first thing to understand is that Civil War winters weren't all exactly the same. Sometimes they were brutally cold, with snow piling up around camps, turning everything white and silent. Other times, especially further south, the problem was a miserable mix of rain, mud, and freezing nights that seemed to stretch on forever. Either way, soldiers quickly learned that Mother Nature could be just as cruel as any general on the battlefield. Imagine being on picket duty, standing guard at night, out in the open, with no fire allowed, because it would give away your position. The icy wind stings your face, your hands are numb, and your feet feel like blocks of wood inside worn-out shoes. A soldier who nodded off in those conditions might not wake up again. Some men literally froze to death while on duty, their bodies discovered stiff and still at dawn. That's the kind of harsh reality we're talking about. But the cold didn't just threaten lives directly, it wore down morale, too. Soldiers weren't machines, they were human beings who missed their homes, their families, and warm meals by a fireplace. The winter camp was supposed to be a place of rest between campaigns, but for many, it became another kind of suffering. You couldn't escape the chill, even inside a tent or hut. The dampness clung to you, and the smoke from makeshift fires stung your eyes. There's a saying among veterans that the winter felt longer than the war itself. Time seemed to crawl. Days were filled with mud, drilling, and trying to stay warm. Nights stretched out endlessly, with the wind rattling the canvas above your head. Every gust of cold air reminded soldiers of just how far from home they really were. And yet, the war had to go on. Generals didn't always call off campaigns just because the weather was miserable. Some of the war's most famous marches, like Sherman's through Georgia, took place in winter conditions. Soldiers tramped for miles through sleet and mud, their clothes soaked and their spirits low. The landscape itself became another enemy. Think about how simple things turned into struggles. Crossing a frozen river wasn't just dangerous, it could be deadly if the ice broke. Wagons got stuck in icy ruts. Horses slipped on frozen ground. Even cooking a hot meal became a challenge when the wood was damp and the wind howled through camp. What we consider ordinary inconveniences today were life and death obstacles for soldiers back then. So, why did the winters matter so much in the Civil War? Well, because the armies weren't just fighting each other, they were fighting to survive the elements. Winter changed how strategies were planned, how battles were fought, and how soldiers endured. Armies often slowed down or even paused their campaigns because the men couldn't move through the mud or snow. This gave everyone time to dig in, build shelters, and try to outlast the season. But it also meant months of waiting, freezing, and sometimes wondering if the war would ever end. One soldier wrote in his diary that he feared the chill of the night air more than the rebel bullets. Another described how the frost coated his blanket like sugar. Except this wasn't sweet, it was misery. The cold didn't discriminate. Whether you wore blue or grey, whether you fought for the Union or the Confederacy, the winter punished everyone equally. Now, that's not to say every moment was pure suffering. Soldiers were surprisingly resilient. They found ways to cope, to laugh, to tell stories by the fire when they had one. But those moments of warmth were hard-won and temporary. Step away from the flames, and the night swallowed you in its icy grip. It's worth remembering that most of these men were young. Many were teenagers, or barely in their 20s, far from home for the first time. They weren't hardened survivalists, they were farm boys, clerks, teachers, ordinary people, suddenly thrown into extraordinary hardship. Facing battle was one thing, but facing weeks of bitter cold tested a different kind of courage. If you've ever shivered waiting for the bus on a winter morning, you've had just a tiny taste of what they felt. Now imagine that, but with no bus coming, no heated home waiting, and no proper winter gear to save you. Just miles of frozen ground, endless nights, and a war that refused to let you rest. As we move forward through this story, keep in mind that winter in the Civil War wasn't just a backdrop. It was an active force, shaping decisions and testing endurance. Every blanket, every campfire, every moment of warmth mattered. Soldiers had to get creative to survive, and sometimes, even creativity wasn't enough. The brutal cold of the Civil War reminds us that history isn't just about battles and famous names. It's about the human experience, the small, often overlooked struggles that define daily life. For many soldiers, the fight against the cold was as memorable and as deadly as any clash with the enemy. So, as you settle into bed tonight, under your cozy blankets, maybe with the heater humming softly in the background, think of those men. The ones who huddled together in flimsy tents, who warmed their hands over smoky fires, who endured frostbitten nights with no guarantee of tomorrow. Their story is one of endurance, of hardship, and ultimately, of survival against the odds. And that's where our journey begins, at the edge of a frozen battlefield, where the war against the cold was just as fierce as the war against each other. The human body versus the elements. If there's one thing humans are good at, it's underestimating nature. The Civil War soldiers probably expected bullets, bayonets, and cannons to be the biggest dangers. And don't get me wrong, those were definitely a problem. But winter was the kind of enemy that didn't care about uniforms, ranks, or strategies. It attacked everyone, silently, and sometimes fatally. The human body just isn't built for standing still in freezing weather. We're warm-blooded creatures, which means we have to keep our internal temperature steady, around 98 degrees. Drop that too far, and things go downhill quickly. Today, if you start to get hypothermia, you'd be wrapped in thermal blankets, maybe rushed to a hospital. Back then, good luck. Let's talk about frostbite first. You probably know the word, but soldiers in the 1860s knew it far too well. Frostbite sets in when skin and tissue literally freeze. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were the first victims. Imagine waking up and realizing your toes had turned black and hard, like little lumps of charcoal. In extreme cases, amputation was the only option, which was a polite way of saying you lost a part of yourself to the cold. One Union soldier remembered pulling off his boots and finding that 2 of his toes were basically gone, just shriveled, black stubs. He wrote that it didn't even hurt at first. That's the scary thing about frostbite. Once you're numb, you don't feel the damage until it's too late. And it wasn't just frostbite. The cold also sapped energy in sneaky ways. Shivering is your body's natural defense. It's basically your muscles working overtime to create heat. But shivering burns calories fast. Remember, these soldiers weren't eating high-calorie snacks or sipping hot cocoa. They were on limited rations, hardtack biscuits, a bit of salt pork, maybe some beans if they were lucky. Not exactly a diet designed to fuel long nights in the cold. That combination, low food, thin clothing, constant exposure, meant soldiers burned through their energy reserves quickly. Many grew weak, sluggish, and more vulnerable to sickness. Malnutrition and cold are like a tag team of misery. One makes you weaker, the other finishes you off. Speaking of sickness, pneumonia was everywhere in winter camps. Cold, damp air plus crowded, smoky shelters was the perfect recipe for lung infections. Soldiers coughed, wheezed, and struggled to breathe. In an era before antibiotics, pneumonia could be deadly. Add in things like dysentery and measles, and winter turned camps into giant sickbeds. Doctors did what they could. But remember, this was the 1860s. Germ theory was still new, and treatments were often worse than the illness. For a fever, you might get bloodletting. For frostbite, maybe rubbing the skin with snow. Yes, really, it's a miracle anyone survived at all. Now, picture being on guard duty in the middle of all this. You're posted along a dark picket line, standing watch while icy wind cuts through your uniform. No fire allowed, no moving around much, because that would draw attention. Just you, your musket, and the cold. Some soldiers literally froze to death, like statues at their posts. They were found in the morning, rifles still in hand, bodies stiff with frost. That's how unforgiving the elements could be. But soldiers weren't helpless. They learned tricks to fight back. Some stuffed straw, grass, or even scraps of paper inside their clothes for insulation. Others wrapped their feet in rags or animal hides. A few slept huddled together, not out of friendship, but pure survival like penguins, except with rifles. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept them alive. There are stories of men heating bullets or stones in the fire, and then slipping them into their pockets as makeshift hand warmers. Not exactly safe, but when your fingers are freezing off, safety isn't your top priority. Desperation leads to creativity, and Civil War soldiers were nothing if not creative. Of course, not every soldier coped well. Some simply gave up. Desertion was especially tempting in the winter months. Why risk frostbite, sickness, and starvation when you could just walk home? The cold broke men's spirits as surely as it froze their bodies. Letters from the time are full of complaints about the weather. Soldiers begged their families to send socks, gloves, or even just sympathy. One Confederate soldier wrote home, "If the Yankees don't kill me, the winter surely will." And he wasn't exaggerating. Statistically, disease and exposure killed far more soldiers in the Civil War than actual combat. The cold was an invisible battlefield, claiming lives quietly, night after night. But here is the remarkable thing. So many soldiers did endure. They pushed through frostbitten nights, coughing fits, and endless hunger. They adapted, they improvised, and somehow, they survived long enough to see spring. That resilience is part of what makes their story so compelling. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men whose bodies were pushed to the limit. And yet they kept going. So, when we think of the Civil War, it's easy to picture cannons firing or dramatic charges across smoky fields. But the real war, the one fought every single day, was often quieter. It was the fight to keep your body warm, your stomach full, and your spirit intact. The human body is tough, but winter in the 1860s tested every ounce of toughness a soldier had. Frostbite, pneumonia, malnutrition, they were all part of the daily struggle. And if you made it through one night, congratulations. Tomorrow you got to do it all over again. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe wrapped up in a blanket or two, think about the men who didn't have that luxury, who curled up on frozen ground, listening to the wind howl, praying for the dawn. Their bodies battled the elements as fiercely as their armies battled each other. And that's the heart of this chapter. The human body versus the cold. Sometimes the body won, sometimes the cold did. But either way, every winter left its mark. Makeshift winter quarters. When most people think of Civil War soldiers, they probably imagine neat rows of white tents, maybe a bugle sounding in the distance. But let's be honest, when winter rolled in, that picture-perfect camp setup didn't last long. A thin canvas tent was about as useful as a paper umbrella in a snowstorm. Soldiers quickly realized if they wanted to survive the season, they'd have to get creative and build themselves something sturdier. So, what did they do? They became part-time carpenters, part-time engineers, and full-time improvisers. Welcome to the world of makeshift winter quarters, where every cabin, hut, and dugout was a masterpiece of survival architecture. Let's start with the basics. Most winter quarters began with whatever nature offered: trees, dirt, and a whole lot of mud. Soldiers chopped down nearby timber, which often irritated local civilians, and dragged the logs back to camp. Then they stacked them, cabin style, sometimes using mud or clay as mortar to seal the gaps. Roofs might be made of logs covered with branches, bark, or canvas. Was it warm? Well, warmer than nothing. Was it comfortable? Only if your definition of comfortable includes smoke-filled air and damp straw bedding. Some soldiers dug their shelters halfway underground, creating what they called dugouts. The idea was simple: earth insulates. So, by burrowing into a hillside or sinking a pit in the ground, you got protection from wind and cold. On top, you'd build a log or canvas roof. Inside, you might throw down straw, pine needles, or just your blanket and call it home. Of course, this setup had its own problems. Rain could turn your dugout into a muddy swimming pool, and snowmelt had a habit of dripping through the roof. Still, for many soldiers, it beat freezing in a tent. Now, not all shelters were created equal. Officers often got the best spots and the sturdiest cabins, sometimes even with little chimneys or crude furniture. Enlisted men, on the other hand, packed into smaller, rougher huts, 4 to 6 soldiers per cabin. Privacy? Forget it. Warmth? If you all squeezed together, maybe. One soldier joked that the real insulation was the smell of his comrades, which wasn't exactly reassuring. Fires were essential, of course, but indoor fires came with hazards. Most huts had tiny fireplaces or clay chimneys, but these weren't exactly built to code. Chimneys collapsed, sparks flew, and cabins sometimes burned down in the middle of the night. Imagine surviving a battle only to lose your blanket, rifle, and dignity because your shelter went up in flames. It happened more than once. And let's talk about the smoke. With poor ventilation, huts often filled with thick, choking air. Soldiers wrote in their diaries about waking up with eyes watering, lungs burning, and throats raw from breathing smoke all night. One soldier described it as living inside a chimney. Cozy, right. Despite the drawbacks, there was something strangely homey about these winter cabins. Men decorated them with whatever scraps they could find: old boards, bits of cloth, even captured enemy supplies. Some carved shelves into the walls, built crude tables, or fashioned bunks out of branches. A few camps even got nicknames, like Logstown or Mud City, because of the clusters of makeshift cabins. It was a little slice of civilization in the middle of chaos. For entertainment, soldiers sometimes carved checkerboards into tables or whittled pieces for games. If they had paper, they tacked up letters from home on the walls. Others doodled graffiti, scratched their names into logs, or hung trophies like animal skulls. These huts weren't pretty, but they became personal spaces in a world where soldiers had almost nothing of their own. Of course, there were plenty of complaints. Some soldiers hated the mud, the leaks, the lack of real warmth. Others grumbled about sharing cramped quarters with men who snored, coughed, or never bathed. Hygiene wasn't exactly a priority, and in a crowded cabin, sickness spread fast. Lice thrived in the straw bedding, and rats scurried around scavenging crumbs. So if the cold didn't get you, the pests might. Still, for all the misery, winter huts could also be places of bonding, sitting shoulder to shoulder, swapping stories, and laughing by the fire created a sense of brotherhood. Soldiers from different towns, farms, or even countries became unlikely families. Some veterans later said their fondest memories weren't of battles, but of winter nights spent in those smoky, ramshackle huts. It's funny how hardship sometimes forges the strongest friendships. Every now and then, soldiers got lucky. In areas near towns, they might borrow lumber, bricks, or even furniture from local houses and barns. Some civilians willingly traded, others not so much. In some cases, entire barns were dismantled to build winter quarters. The line between foraging and looting was a little blurry, let's just say. But survival doesn't always follow polite rules. When spring finally came, these huts were abandoned. Armies marched on, leaving behind ghost towns of empty cabins, broken chimneys, and muddy trenches. For historians, these ruins tell a story of human resilience, the way ordinary men built little pockets of shelter in the middle of war. If you think about it, there's something almost touching about those huts. They were temporary, uncomfortable, and often dangerous, but they represented a soldier's instinct to make the best of a bad situation, to carve out a little corner of warmth and normalcy in a world that had gone completely mad. So, As you picture the Civil War in your mind, don't just see the battlefield charges and booming cannons. Remember the quiet villages of log huts, the smoky dugouts, the muddy shelters where men huddled together through long, frozen nights. That was just as much a part of the war as the fighting. And maybe, the next time your heater clicks on or you crawl into a cozy bed, you'll think of those soldiers bundled in rags, sleeping in cabins that smelled of smoke and sweat, finding small comfort in the shelters they built with their own hands. Because in the end, survival in winter wasn't just about bravery on the battlefield. It was about chopping wood, stacking logs, and creating a little warmth where there wasn't any. Blankets, tents, and whatever else they could find. If you've ever camped outside in winter, you know how important a good sleeping bag or a thick blanket is. Now, imagine trying to get through freezing nights with nothing but one thin wool blanket, or worse, no blanket at all. Welcome to the life of a Civil War soldier. Let's start with tents. The standard issue for many soldiers was something called a shelter half. Sounds impressive, right? Not really. Each man carried half of a small tent, basically a canvas sheet with some buttons. When two soldiers met up, they could button their halves together and create one tiny tent, barely big enough for both to crawl under. And shelter half was an accurate name, because that's about all it gave you: half shelter. Rain leaked in, snow blew under the sides, and the cold air laughed at your attempt to stay warm. Now, larger canvas tents did exist. Officers often had wall tents, which were taller and roomier, but for the average soldier, the little pup tent was home. And in winter, that wasn't much protection. Canvas doesn't insulate, it just flaps in the wind and gets heavy when wet. Soldiers tried to improve their tents by stacking logs around the base, sealing cracks with mud, or draping extra fabric over the top. Some even dug shallow pits inside the tent so they could sit or lie below ground level, where it was slightly warmer. But no matter what tricks they used, the tents were never really warm. That's where blankets came in, or should have come in. The problem was, there just weren't enough to go around. Union soldiers were more likely to have a wool blanket issued to them, though supply problems still happened. Confederates, on the other hand, often went without. Some men carried old quilts from home, or patched together rags that barely counted as covers. Others relied on captured supplies from Union camps. If you found yourself wrapped up in a proper blanket on a winter night, you were one of the lucky ones. But blankets alone weren't enough. Soldiers learned to pile anything they could find on top of themselves for insulation: extra clothing, sacks, even saddle blankets from horses. Some stuffed grass, straw, or pine needles between layers of fabric to trap heat. It wasn't elegant, but it helped. One soldier wrote in his diary that he wrapped himself in 2 shirts, a coat, 3 pairs of socks, and half a tent. He still shivered all night. Sleeping arrangements were another challenge. The ground was cold and damp, so soldiers tried to put something between themselves and the earth boards if they had them, straw if they were lucky, or just pine branches stripped from nearby trees. Even then, many nights were spent tossing and turning, trying to find warmth where there wasn't any. And sharing was common. 2, 3, even 4 men might huddle under the same blanket. Not exactly glamorous, but body heat is a powerful survival tool. Of course, not every soldier was thrilled about sharing. Imagine snuggling up with someone who hadn't bathed in months, who coughed all night, or who snored like a cannon. Some joked that it was like being married, except without any of the benefits. Still, when your choices were be cold or be cozy with a buddy, most men swallowed their pride and chose the second option. Then there were the lucky few who managed to snag more creative covers. Animal hides sometimes served as makeshift blankets. Old carpets, discarded curtains, or even tablecloths found in abandoned houses were repurposed as bedding. One Confederate soldier bragged about wrapping himself in a stolen Yankee overcoat, calling it the warmest thing he'd owned all winter. Necessity didn't just breed invention, it bred shameless scavenging. But warmth wasn't the only problem. Keeping things dry mattered just as much. Wet blankets were worse than no blankets at all. Soldiers dreaded nights of freezing rain, when everything they owned turned soggy. They would hang blankets by the fire, but too close and the wool scorched too far and it never dried. Some men laid their blankets on branches to air out, while others just endured the misery of crawling under damp covers and trying to sleep. The value of a good blanket can't be overstated. Soldiers wrote home begging for them. Families mailed quilts stitched with love, often embroidered with names or little messages. These weren't just practical, they were emotional lifelines, reminders of home in a world that felt far away. To lose your blanket was a disaster. To gain an extra one was like winning the lottery. Tents and blankets also became symbols of inequality in the armies. Officers, with their wall tents and extra bedding, lived in relative comfort. Meanwhile, ordinary soldiers shivered in pup tents, wondering why equality stopped at the flap of a canvas door. Some men joked bitterly that the generals were fighting a different war altogether, one fought with feather beds instead of bullets. Still, soldiers did what they could with what they had. They stitched holes, patched worn spots, and guarded their blankets carefully. In the chaos of camp life, blankets were stolen, traded, or borrowed and never returned. A man's blanket was his lifeline, and he treated it like gold. Think about it this way. Today, most of us don't give our blankets a second thought. They're just there, waiting at the end of the bed. But for a Civil War soldier, a blanket could mean the difference between surviving the night or not. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was hope, comfort, and warmth, all rolled into one. So, when you picture those long winter nights in Civil War camps, imagine rows of flimsy tents, patched with mud and cloth, filled with men huddled under thin blankets. Imagine the quiet rustle as soldiers shifted and coughed, the canvas flapping in the wind, and the endless shivering under covers that weren't quite enough. And as you drift off tonight, wrapped in your warm blanket, maybe spare a thought for those men. They would have given anything to trade places with you, to have a soft bed, a roof that didn't leak, and a blanket that actually kept out the cold. For them, warmth wasn't guaranteed. It was a daily struggle, fought with whatever scraps they could find. Because sometimes survival boiled down to this: one blanket, one tent, and a whole lot of hope. Fires, smoke, and staying warm if blankets were a soldier's best friend in winter. Then fire was his lifeline. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could lift the spirits of a frozen Civil War camp quite like a good blaze. Fire meant warmth, light, and maybe even hot food if you were lucky. But it also meant smoke, danger, and sometimes disaster. Let's start with the basics. Civil War soldiers were masters at building campfires. After all, when the temperature dropped below freezing and you had no central heating, you got very motivated to learn. A few logs, some twigs, and a spark could mean the difference between misery and a half-decent night's sleep. But even when fires worked, they came with problems. The first issue was fuel. Armies were massive, tens of thousands of men all camping in the same area. That meant a lot of wood was needed to keep fires going. Soldiers chopped down forests around their camps so thoroughly that locals joked you could always tell where the army had been by the stumps left behind. In some places, the hunt for fire would stretch miles from camp, and men spent hours each day hauling backlogs just to survive the night. Now, once you had your firewood, you still had to deal with smoke, and smoke was everywhere. In open-air fires, it blew into your face, no matter where you sat, something every camper today can relate to. In winter huts with tiny chimneys, it was even worse. The chimneys were often built out of clay or mud, and they had a nasty habit of collapsing. When that happened, the whole hut filled with thick smoke, leaving the soldiers coughing, choking, and scrambling outside with tears streaming down their faces. One soldier wrote that he'd rather face a cannon than another smoky chimney. Then there was the risk of fire itself. A little spark could easily set a whole hut or tent ablaze. Blankets, straw bedding, and wooden roofs were basically tinder waiting to ignite. More than a few soldiers lost all their possessions in sudden campfires. Imagine waking up warm and cozy only to realize the cabin was on fire, and now you had no blanket, no musket, and no dignity. It happened more often than you'd think. But the dangers didn't stop soldiers from gathering around fires. Fires were the heart of camp life. Men sat in circles, warming their hands, swapping stories, and singing songs. It was a social space as much as a survival tool. Soldiers joked, played cards, and roasted whatever food they had over the flames. If someone had managed to forage a chicken or rabbit, it became a feast, cooked right there on the campfire. For a few hours, the war felt far away. Of course, not everyone could enjoy a fire. Picket duty, the lonely job of standing guard, often meant no flames allowed. A glowing fire was basically a neon sign saying, "Here we are," to the enemy. So men on picket lines shivered in the dark, sometimes rubbing their hands together or stamping their feet to keep warm. The cold was one thing, but the boredom made it worse. Some soldiers admitted they would have risked getting shot just for a few minutes of firelight. Even inside camp, fire was sometimes rationed. In larger encampments, generals worried about wood shortages or accidents. That meant smaller, controlled fires instead of big roaring ones. Soldiers grumbled, of course, but rules were rules. Then again, soldiers were also experts at breaking rules when survival was at stake. Many built secret little fires, hidden from officers, just to toast their frozen fingers. There's another side to fire worth mentioning: morale. A fire wasn't just physical warmth, it was emotional warmth. Sitting in the glow, listening to logs crackle, gave men a sense of comfort that no blanket could provide. Fires became gathering spots for laughter, songs, and even moments of reflection. Letters home were often written by firelight. Poems were read, prayers whispered, and friendships deepened as men shared stories late into the night. But fires weren't always cheerful. Sometimes they were reminders of what soldiers didn't have. A fire without enough would burn low and weak, offering only a faint glow. On stormy nights, fires sputtered and died, leaving men to huddle in the dark. And in some cases, fuel ran out completely, leaving whole companies shivering together, cursing the cold and dreaming of summer. There's a story of Confederate soldiers in Virginia who ran out of firewood during one brutal winter. They ended up tearing apart their own huts for fuel, burning the walls just to keep from freezing. By the end, they had nothing left but chimneys standing in the snow, like sad monuments to their desperation. On the flip side, some soldiers got creative with what they burned. Old wagons, fence posts, furniture if it was wood. It was firewood. Civilians weren't always happy about this. Imagine waking up to find the soldiers had borrowed your barn doors or stripped your orchard trees bare. For the soldiers, though, survival came first. Courtesy to property owners was a distant second. Despite all the challenges, fire was life. Without it, soldiers wouldn't have stood a chance against the long, frozen nights. With it, they had at least a fighting chance to stay warm, to cook a meal, and to remind themselves they were still human in the middle of so much misery. So, when you picture a Civil War winter camp, don't just see the huts and tents. Picture the glow of countless little fires, flickering against the dark sky. Picture soldiers crowded around them, hands stretched out, steam rising from damp clothes, voices rising in song or laughter. Picture the smoke drifting across the camp, clinging to everything, stinging eyes and lungs, but somehow making it all feel a little more bearable. Because in the Civil War, fire wasn't just about staying alive, it was about staying human. And sometimes, in the coldest, darkest nights, that little circle of warmth made all the difference. Clothing or lack of it. When you think of soldiers in the Civil War, you probably imagine neat blue or grey uniforms, shiny brass buttons, and maybe a fancy cap tilted just right. And sure, at the start of the war, some men looked like that, parading proudly in crisp new outfits. But after a few months of marching, sweating, and sleeping in the mud, those uniforms looked less military fashion and more ragged scarecrow. And in winter, the situation got even worse. The truth is, neither the Union nor the Confederacy was really prepared to clothe hundreds of thousands of men for years of war. Factories couldn't keep up. Supply wagons got delayed. Soldiers often wore whatever they had, patched up with whatever they could find. Winter gear was in especially short supply, and many men faced freezing weather in clothing better suited for autumn picnics. Let's start with the Union. Compared to the Confederates, Union soldiers generally had it better. The North had more factories, more railroads, and more wool. A Union soldier might get a standard wool coat, a pair of trousers, a cap called a forage hat, and hopefully a pair of decent boots. But that doesn't mean they were cozy. Wool was warm, yes, but it was also heavy and itchy. Wet wool smelled like a wet dog and took forever to dry. Boots wore out quickly, and replacements didn't always arrive on time. Some soldiers cut holes in their shoes just to give their toes room after months of marching. Warm socks were a luxury, and soldiers often begged families to send them by mail. Now for the Confederates. Things were much rougher in the South. The Confederacy didn't have the same industrial base, so uniforms were often mismatched, homemade, or just plain falling apart. There are countless stories of Confederate soldiers marching barefoot through snow and ice. Yes, barefoot. Imagine trying to cross frozen ground with nothing on your feet but rags or maybe strips of leather tied together. One Confederate recalled that his feet were so numb, he couldn't feel them for weeks. And when they did get shoes, they weren't always great. Confederate brogan shoes were cheaply made and wore out quickly. Some men patched them with pieces of wagon canvas, while others just gave up and walked barefoot. Frostbite was common, and toes were often lost to the cold. Soldiers joked grimly that the Confederacy wasn't just losing battles, it was losing socks. Uniforms themselves varied wildly. Early in the war, Confederate units wore whatever they had, leading to confusion on the battlefield. By winter, many soldiers were dressed in a mix of grey, brown, and butternut-colored rags. One soldier described his outfit as a quilt of patches, no two alike. Union soldiers sometimes looked sharper, but even they ended up with holes in their coats, missing buttons, and pants so worn the knees gave out. To fight the cold, soldiers layered whatever they could. Some wrapped themselves in scarves, knitted by family back home. Others stuffed newspapers or straw into their clothes for insulation. A few wore captured enemy uniforms, which sometimes caused awkward situations when they were mistaken for the other side. One Confederate soldier was nearly shot by his own comrades for looking too much like a Yankee in his stolen coat. Headgear was another challenge. Standard issue forage caps didn't cover much of the head or ears, which made them almost useless in freezing winds. Soldiers improvised with knit caps, hoods, or even rags tied around their heads. Gloves were rare, so many men went without, their hands cracked and bleeding from the cold. Some wrapped strips of cloth around their fingers just to keep them from stiffening up. Blankets, as we've talked about, were precious, but coats were just as important. A long wool overcoat was worth its weight in gold. Soldiers who had them guarded them carefully, and those without often suffered bitterly. Stories spread of men trading tobacco, food, or even weapons just for a decent coat. But clothing wasn't only about survival, it was about pride. Soldiers took great care in patching and maintaining what they had. They might be ragged, but they still tried to look like soldiers. Sewing circles back home worked tirelessly to send new uniforms, socks, and gloves. Women knitted scarves and mittens, pouring love into every stitch. Receiving a package from home wasn't just about getting warm, it was about being reminded that someone cared. Still, the reality was harsh. Soldiers often looked more like beggars than fighters. Rags wrapped around feet, coats made of stitched-together scraps, hats with holes so big they barely qualified as hats. And yet, in the middle of this misery, soldiers joked about their appearance. Humor was a kind of shield. One Confederate said his uniform was so patched up, he didn't know which color he was supposed to be fighting for. Another Union soldier bragged that his socks were actually sleeves from an old shirt. Despite the suffering, there's something deeply human in these stories. Clothing wasn't just fabric, it was survival, identity, and dignity all rolled together. Every patch, every extra layer, every pair of socks represented effort, care, and determination. So, when you picture a Civil War soldier in winter, Don't imagine a neat museum uniform. Imagine a young man in a coat 3 sizes too big, with a cap that barely fits, boots patched with string, and socks made from rags. Imagine him shivering, laughing with his buddies about how ridiculous they all look, and somehow finding the strength to keep going. Because in the end, survival wasn't about looking sharp. It was about piling on whatever you could find, wrapping yourself in scraps, and marching forward cold, hungry, and determined. Food and warmth, if clothing and blankets were a soldier's armor against the cold, then food was his fuel. And in the bitter winters of the Civil War, soldiers burned through that fuel fast. Keeping warm wasn't just about huddling by the fire, it was also about eating enough to keep your body running like a little human furnace. Problem was, the food situation was, let's just say, less than inspiring. Let's start with the Union side. Union soldiers had better supply lines, which meant they usually had something to eat, even if it wasn't very appetizing. Their rations often included hardtack, those brick-like biscuits tough enough to crack a tooth. Hardtack was basically flour, water, and a lot of wishful thinking. It didn't spoil easily, which made it perfect for feeding thousands of men on the move. But in winter, when the crackers got damp and froze, they turned into something closer to cement. Soldiers joked that hardtack could stop a bullet or at least break a jaw. Alongside hardtack, Union soldiers often had salted pork or beef. In theory, this was protein to keep them strong. In reality, the meat was so salty and tough it had to be boiled 4 hours just to be edible. Even then, it sometimes came crawling with maggots. Imagine sitting in the cold, stomach growling, waiting for your chunk of pork to stop looking like a science experiment. Appetite gone. On the Confederate side, things were even tougher. Supplies were short, railroads were stretched thin, and blockades made it nearly impossible to bring in enough food. Confederate soldiers often lived on cornmeal and whatever else they could scrounge. A common meal was corn dodgers, basically fried corn cakes. Not terrible, but not exactly filling when you're burning thousands of calories just trying not to freeze. Some soldiers boiled corn kernels into a kind of soup, which one man described as thin enough to read a newspaper through. Both sides relied heavily on coffee, or, in the case of the Confederates, coffee substitutes. Union soldiers loved their coffee so much that generals actually measured its importance. It was hot, it gave energy, and it made freezing mornings a little more bearable. Confederates, cut off from imports, had to improvise with roasted chicory, acorns, or even ground up sweet potatoes. The taste, let's just say no modern coffee shop would serve it. But when you're shivering in the dark, even fake coffee felt like a miracle. Now, here is the thing, food wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about warmth. Eating gave soldiers the calories they needed to keep their bodies from shutting down in the cold. A hot meal could lift spirits, give strength, and make the difference between a miserable night and a survivable one. That's why soldiers guarded their rations so carefully, and why food shortages hit so hard. Of course, not every meal came from official supplies. Soldiers became experts at foraging, a polite word for raiding local farms and barns. Chickens mysteriously vanished. Pigs trotted off, never to be seen again. Orchards found themselves picked clean. For the soldiers, it was survival. For the civilians, it was often theft. But in the freezing months, morals sometimes bent under the pressure of hunger. Cooking in camp was another adventure. With limited ingredients and fewer tools, soldiers had to get creative. They mixed hardtack with water and fried it in bacon grease to make skilly golly, which sounds about as appetizing as it looks. Others crumbled hardtack into coffee, just to soften it enough to chew. Some roasted cornmeal as sticks over the fire like makeshift corn dogs. Not exactly gourmet dining, but it was food, and food meant warmth. Then there were the treats, rare but unforgettable. A package from home with cookies, dried fruit, or a jar of jam could turn a freezing night into a celebration. Soldiers shared these treasures around the fire, savoring every bite. Letters often mention how such small comforts lifted morale more than anything else. A spoonful of apple butter could feel like a feast when you'd been eating plain cornmeal 4 weeks. But the harsh truth is that many soldiers went hungry, especially in Confederate camps. When rations ran low, men weakened quickly. Hunger made the cold feel sharper, the nights longer, and the marches harder. Some soldiers admitted that hunger was worse than the freezing air it gnawed at them constantly. There are stories of men boiling leather belts or shoe soles just to have something, anything, in their stomachs. Yet, through all of this, soldiers found ways to laugh about their food. They gave nicknames to their meals. Hardtack was sometimes called sheet iron crackers, and salted beef was salt horse. They wrote songs and jokes about their rations, poking fun at the very things that made their lives miserable. Humor became seasoning in a diet that otherwise had none. So, when you think about Civil War winters, picture not just the cold wind and the snow, but also the smell of smoke and boiling pork, the crunch of hardtack, and the chatter of men eating together. Food wasn't always good, but it was life. And in the brutal cold, every bite mattered. Because staying warm wasn't only about fires and blankets. It was also about fuel, about giving your body the energy to fight the cold, the hunger, and the endless war. Disease and frostbite. If the cold itself wasn't enough to ruin a soldier's winter, the sickness that came with it certainly did. Life in a Civil War camp wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was also about fighting the endless parade of coughs, chills, and nasty diseases that thrived when thousands of men were crammed together in freezing, filthy conditions. Let's start with frostbite, the most obvious enemy of winter. Marching 4 miles with wet socks, leaky boots, and snow up to your ankles meant toes were in constant danger. Soldiers often didn't realize how bad it was until it was too late. One man wrote that his feet felt like wood 4 days before he finally admitted he couldn't walk. Doctors, who were already overworked, had little choice but to amputate when frostbite set in. Losing a toe, a foot, or even part of a leg was tragically common, and if the amputation didn't kill you, infection might. Frostbite wasn't the only problem. Hypothermia was another constant threat. Soldiers who fell asleep on picket duty in the freezing cold sometimes never woke up. Others collapsed on long winter marches, their bodies simply unable to keep up. The army could punish you for falling asleep at your post, but it was hard to stay awake when your body was literally shutting down from the cold. Then there were the diseases, many of which actually killed more soldiers than bullets did. Pneumonia and bronchitis were winter regulars, spreading quickly through crowded tents and huts. A simple cough could turn deadly in just a few days, especially when medicine was limited. Soldiers joked about their camp cough, but underneath the laughter, they knew it could mean the end. Smallpox outbreaks occasionally swept through camps, too, though both armies tried to control it with vaccinations. Measles, typhoid, and dysentery were even more common. Imagine being stuck in a smoky hut with 10 other sick men, no fresh air, and a dirt floor. Germs had a field day. Sanitation was, to put it kindly, a disaster. Latrines often froze over or overflowed, and soldiers didn't always bother using them in the middle of the night. Waste ended up near camps, and contaminated water spread disease like wildfire. Winter didn't kill germs, it just made men too cold and tired to deal with them properly. Doctors and nurses did what they could, but supplies were short, and knowledge of infection was limited. Many still believed diseases came from bad air, not bacteria. The cold made recovery harder, too. A soldier with pneumonia needed warmth and rest, but instead he might be lying on a straw bed in a drafty cabin, shivering while his comrades coughed beside him. Medicines like quinine or laudanum were in short supply, and alcohol, when it could be found, was sometimes given as a cure. One soldier claimed whiskey saved him from pneumonia, but let's be honest, it probably just made him forget how miserable he was. Even small injuries became dangerous in the winter. A blister from marching, a cut from chopping wood if it got infected. There was little doctors could do. Without antibiotics, gangrene set in quickly. Amputation was often the only answer, and the survival rate wasn't great. Soldiers dreaded seeing the surgeon's tent almost as much as they dreaded the battlefield. But sickness wasn't only physical, it was mental, too. Winter blues hit hard. Isolation, hunger, and endless cold wore men down. Depression, though not called that back then, was widespread. Some soldiers wrote home about their low spirits, describing the camp as a place of gloom and despair. Others tried to distract themselves with jokes, games, or writing letters, but the weight of sickness and death around them was impossible to ignore. And yet, soldiers found ways to endure. They shared blankets with sick comrades. They built fires to warm those who couldn't move. They wrote letters for men too weak to hold a pen. In some ways, disease and frostbite brought soldiers closer together, reminding them of their shared struggle. Still, the numbers don't lie. For every man killed in battle, about to die from disease. Winter was a silent enemy, as deadly as any musket or cannon. Soldiers marched into war expecting bullets and bayonets, but many ended up fighting coughs, fevers, and frozen feet instead. So when you picture a Civil War winter, don't just think of brave men in uniform standing tall against the snow. Think of the coughing fits echoing through camp, the surgeons sore waiting in the cold, and the quiet rows of graves that grew longer each season. Because in the end, the cold didn't just freeze fingers and toes, it opened the door for sickness to do its worst. And for thousands of soldiers, that was a battle they couldn't win. Morale in the cold, it's one thing to fight battles against an enemy and seethe. It's another thing entirely to fight the cold, the hunger, the sickness, and the crushing boredom of winter camp. For Civil War soldiers, morale, the spirit that kept them going, was constantly under attack during the cold months. And sometimes, staying cheerful was just as important as staying warm. Imagine being stuck in a camp for weeks, maybe months. The snow piles higher every day, the fires smoke up your hut, and the food is the same hardtack you hated yesterday. Add to that the coughing of your sick bunkmates and the fact that your boots are falling apart. It's not exactly a recipe for happiness. And yet, somehow, soldiers found ways to keep their spirits alive. Music was one of the best weapons against low morale. Soldiers carried fiddles, banjos, and harmonicas when they could, and when they couldn't, they sang anyway. Around campfires, you'd hear everything, from rowdy marching songs to quiet hymns. Sometimes, opposing camps even traded tunes across battle lines, the sound of music drifting through the cold night air. For a few minutes, it didn't matter who was wearing blue or grey, everyone was just a freezing human being craving a little comfort. Jokes and humour were just as important. Soldiers had a knack for making fun of their misery. They gave silly nicknames to their rations, poked fun at their ragged clothes, and laughed at each other's attempts to stay warm. One Union soldier wrote that he and his comrades used to tease each other about who had the prettiest frostbite. It sounds dark, but joking made the pain easier to handle. Letters from home were pure gold for morale. Getting a package with socks or cookies was amazing, but even just a letter written in a familiar hand was enough to lift spirits. Soldiers read and reread them until the paper wore thin. Sharing news from home made them feel less isolated, less forgotten. For Confederate soldiers especially, who often felt cut off from everything, Mail Day was like Christmas morning. Games also helped pass the time. Cards were the favourite, with whole evenings spent gambling pennies, buttons, or even rations. Dice games, wrestling matches, and snowball fights broke the monotony. Yes, grown men in uniform sometimes waged massive snowball battles, charging at each other like kids let loose from school. Officers didn't always approve, but the laughter that echoed across camp was proof it was worth it. Religion played a role, too. Winter was often when revival meetings spread through camps, especially on the Confederate side. Preachers would set up makeshift pulpits in huts or tents, and soldiers crowded in to sing hymns and pray together. For many, faith was the one thing that gave them strength to face the cold and the uncertainty of war. But let's be honest, not everyone managed to stay upbeat. Some soldiers sank into gloom. Desertion rates often spiked in the winter. Men slipped away from camp, heading home to warmth, family, and food. Others stayed, but grew bitter, complaining constantly about officers, rations, or the pointlessness of it all. Morale was fragile, and winter pushed it to the edge. The weather also played tricks on morale. A sunny winter day might give soldiers just enough hope to keep going, but a week of icy winds and heavy snow could crush that hope fast. One Confederate wrote that the cold ate into the bones and the spirit alike. Another Union soldier admitted he didn't fear bullets as much as he feared another freezing night with no blanket. Officers knew morale was key, so they tried to keep men busy. Drills, even in the snow, kept soldiers active and distracted. Building huts, repairing roads, and chopping wood gave them something to focus on besides the cold. But too much work, and morale dropped again. It was a balancing act, just enough activity to fight boredom, not so much that exhaustion set in. Despite all this, soldiers somehow found ways to endure. They bonded over shared suffering. They laughed when they could, sang when they wanted to forget, and leaned on each other in the darkest moments. Morale wasn't about being cheerful all the time, it was about refusing to give up completely, even when everything around you seemed miserable. So, when you think about Civil War winters, picture not just the frostbitten toes and the smoky huts, but also the sound of laughter over a card game, the soft strumming of a fiddle, the joy of a long-awaited letter, and the rowdy chaos of a snowball fight. Morale wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep men going, because in the end, surviving winter wasn't just about staying alive, it was about keeping the spirit alive. 2. Letters and home-front connections for Civil War soldiers. Nothing could cut through the cold of winter, a letter from home. Forget fancy uniforms, forget rations, forget even the fire. What really warmed a soldier's heart was the sight of an envelope with his name scrawled across the front. Mail wasn't just paper and ink. It was proof that someone remembered you, cared about you, and wanted you to come back alive. Now, mail delivery wasn't always smooth. Snowstorms, muddy roads, and enemy raids could delay letters for weeks. Imagine waiting and waiting, freezing in a smoky hut, only to hear the mail carrier finally shout, "Post." Soldiers would line up like kids at a candy store, their breath hanging in the cold air. The lucky ones tore open their letters right away. The unlucky ones trudged back to camp with empty hands, trying not to show their disappointment. Union soldiers generally had it better, since the North had more resources to keep mail flowing. Many received letters every week, sometimes even packages filled with socks, mittens, or homemade treats. Confederate soldiers weren't so lucky. With supply lines constantly disrupted, some waited months for a single scrap of news. One Confederate joked that by the time he got a letter, half the people mentioned in it had already died or gotten married. But when a letter did arrive, oh, it was a treasure. Soldiers read them over and over, even by dim firelight. Some carried them tucked close to their hearts, pulling them out in lonely moments. The words of a mother, wife, or sweetheart had the power to chase away the cold, at least for a little while. Packages were even better. Imagine opening a box from home and finding not just socks, but cookies, or maybe a jar of jam carefully packed in straw. These weren't just supplies, they were love in edible form. Soldiers often shared their goodies with bunkmates, turning a dreary winter night into a small celebration. One soldier wrote that a jar of pickles, sent by his family, tasted like heaven itself, which might be the only time pickles have ever gotten that kind of review. Of course, letters went both ways. Soldiers wrote home as often as they could, though ink and paper was sometimes hard to come by. Some scribbled with pencils on scraps of old envelopes, while others carefully penned long letters filled with stories about camp life, battles, or just how cold their toes were. Humor showed up here, too. One Union soldier told his family to worrying about him freezing because, if he did, at least he'd make a fine statue. But not every letter was cheerful. Soldiers also poured out their fears, their loneliness, and their longing for home. Winter had a way of making men feel isolated, far from the warmth of family. Some admitted they cried while writing, their tears smudging the ink. Others asked for prayers, or promised they'd come home as soon as this dreadful war is over. The impact of letters reached beyond individual soldiers. Whole camps could feel the lift when a big delivery came through. Suddenly, the mood was brighter. the laughter louder. A stack of letters could thaw morale better than any fire. On the flip side, long stretches without mail darkened everything. Men grew restless, irritable, and more likely to desert. It wasn't just families writing, either. Communities back home sent letters, too. Churches, schools, and neighbors organized to send encouragement. Soldiers received bundles of letters from children, full of crooked handwriting and clumsy drawings, which made even the hardest men smile. These connections reminded soldiers that they weren't just fighting for generals or governments, they were fighting for real people waiting back home. Of course, mail also carried bad news. A letter might tell of a sick child, a burned farm, or the death of a loved one. For soldiers already weighed down by the cold, this kind of news hit especially hard. Some fell into deep despair after reading such letters, their morale shattered. Winter could be cruel like that, piling sorrow on top of hardship. Still, most soldiers clung to their letters like lifelines. They were folded and refolded until the paper wore thin. Some were kept in pockets through rain, snow, and battles. Others were tied together with string, hidden under blankets, the closest thing to home a soldier could carry. So, when you picture a Civil War soldier in the brutal cold, don't just imagine him huddled in a hut with smoke in his eyes. Picture him holding a letter in his hands, reading by flickering firelight. Picture him smiling at a joke from his brother, or wiping away a tear after a message from his mother. Picture him tucking that piece of paper into his coat, close to his heart, carrying it like a shield against the cold. Because sometimes survival wasn't just about fires, blankets, or food. Sometimes it was about a few words from home, the kind of warmth no winter could take away. Entertainment and pastimes. When soldiers weren't marching, drilling, or shivering, they had one big problem: boredom. Winter camp life stretched on for weeks, sometimes months, with very little action. And as any soldier could tell you, sitting around with nothing to do was almost worse than facing a battle. So how did Civil War soldiers pass the time when the cold locked them in? With a mix of creativity, games, music, and a lot of mischief. Cards were the #1 pastime. Poker, euchre, and faro were favorites. Those soldiers weren't exactly high rollers. Baits were usually for buttons, matches, or rations. Some men gambled away their last piece of bread, which probably made them regret their all-in move the next morning. But win or lose, cards kept hands busy and minds distracted from the cold. Dice games were just as popular. Men carved dice from wood or bone, sometimes using bullets as makeshift markers. Where there was gambling, there were also arguments. One man's lucky roll was another man's cheating trick. Still, it was better than staring at the hot walls. Music filled the camp whenever possible. Soldiers brought fiddles, banjos, or harmonicas, and when instruments weren't around, voices did the job. Campfires turned into concert halls, with men belting out folk songs, hymns, or humorous tunes about army life. Sometimes, songs floated across enemy lines. There are accounts of Union and Confederate soldiers answering each other's music across frozen fields like an impromptu battle of the bands, but with more heart and fewer judges. Reading was another treasured pastime, though books and newspapers weren't always easy to find. Soldiers swapped whatever they had, from Bibles to old novels. Newspapers were devoured, especially when they carried news from home. Of course, rumors spread just as fast, and sometimes faster. One soldier joked that camp gossip could travel quicker than a cannonball. Writing letters, as we saw earlier, also filled many hours. Soldiers scribbled by firelight, carefully crafting words for family back home. For some, writing wasn't just communication, it was therapy. Pouring out complaints about food, the cold, or officers on paper made life a little more bearable. And then there were the more physical entertainments. Wrestling matches broke out in the snow. Men staged races or contests of strength, even in heavy boots and coats. Snowball fights were legendary, massive battles with hundreds of men charging each other, building forts and pelting snow until officers stepped in to restore order. One Union officer described such a fight as the fiercest combat of the season, which probably says a lot about how dull winter could be. Some soldiers tried their hand at theatre. Makeshift plays were put together, with men dressing up in costumes cobbled from whatever they had. Female roles, of course, were played by men, often with hilarious results. Audiences packed into huts, cheering and laughing, grateful for the chance to forget the cold. Crafting also kept hands busy. Soldiers whittled wood into pipes, canes, or small trinkets. Bullets were melted down into chess pieces. One soldier carved a miniature violin out of bone, proving that boredom can spark surprising talent. These little creations often became keepsakes, reminders of the strange mix of misery and creativity in camp life. Not all pastimes were wholesome, though. Drinking was common when alcohol could be found. Some soldiers brewed their own crude versions, which probably did more harm than good. Others spent time arguing or brawling, especially when tempers flared in the cramped quarters of a smoky hut. Officers did their best to keep discipline, but when thousands of restless men were stuck in the cold, mischief was bound to happen. Religion, too, provided structure and comfort. Prayer meetings, Bible readings, and hymn singing gave soldiers a sense of purpose beyond survival. These gatherings often doubled as entertainment, drawing crowds eager for both spiritual comfort and social connection. The variety of pastimes reveals something important. Even in the bleakest winters, soldiers found ways to be human. They laughed, sang, played, and created. They turned boredom into moments of joy, however small. Entertainment didn't erase the cold, but it made the nights a little warmer, the days a little shorter, and the war a little easier to bear. So, when you picture a Civil War winter camp, don't just see rows of shivering soldiers huddled by fires. Picture the laughter around a card game, the echo of a fiddle in the night air, the chaos of a snowball battle, and the quiet concentration of a soldier whittling wood. Picture men turning misery into moments of fun, proving that even in the harshest cold, the human spirit has a way of entertaining itself. Because sometimes, survival wasn't just about warmth and food, it was about finding something, anything, to smile about in the middle of the cold. Shelter innovations. If there's one thing winter in the Civil War taught soldiers, it was how to get creative with shelter. Army-issued tents and standard huts were fine for mild weather, but when the snow came down and the winds cut through like knives, men had to innovate or freeze. And while not every soldier turned into a master architect, the camps often looked like sprawling villages of makeshift engineering projects. At first, most armies relied on tents. The standard dog tent was small, flimsy, and barely large enough for two men to lie down in. It was called a dog tent because, well, only a dog might actually enjoy sleeping in one. In winter, these canvas shelters were practically useless. Snow piled on top, the cold seeped in, and soldiers woke up with frost on their blankets. So the men got creative. They dug trenches around tents to keep water out. They built little fireplaces at the entrance, running crude chimneys out of sticks and mud. Some buried the bottom of the tent's flaps in the snow to keep out the wind. These little tricks made life a bit more bearable, though not by much. Then came the huts. Soldiers cut down trees and stacked logs to make cabins. Sometimes they used split rails or planks scavenged from nearby barns. Roofs were covered with more logs, sticks, or even pieces of old tents. The results varied wildly. Some huts looked sturdy enough to last a decade, while others looked ready to collapse in the next breeze. But even a rickety hut was better than a freezing tent. Inside, soldiers got even more inventive. Floors were lined with pine boughs or straw to keep feet off the frozen ground. Bunks were built along the walls, often stacked like bunk beds to fit more men. Mud plaster filled the cracks between logs to block the wind, and if a soldier had real skill, he might even fashion a little table or stool. Suddenly, camp life felt almost cozy, at least until the smoke from the fireplace filled the hut and left everyone coughing. Speaking of fireplaces, heating was a constant experiment. Some soldiers built stone chimneys, others stacked mud and sticks, and a few just cut holes in the roof and hoped the smoke would find its way out. Fires had to be kept small, because big flames could set the whole hut ablaze. Still, a working fireplace was worth its weight in gold. It meant warmth, hot food, and a gathering spot for stories and laughter. Another clever trick was the dugout. Soldiers dug into hillsides or river banks, carving out rooms below ground level. The earth provided natural insulation, keeping the worst of the cold at bay. With logs over the top and a chimney poking out, dugouts became snug little homes. Of course, they also leaked when it rained, and sometimes collapsed, but hey, at least they were warm until then. Some units took shelter building to an art form. There are stories of cabins complete with porches, shelves, and even windows made from glass scavenged nearby. One camp had a row of huts, so neatly built that soldiers nicknamed it Chimneyville. Visitors compared some winter camps to small towns, complete with streets, cooking areas, and even theaters. Not bad for a bunch of soldiers who were supposed to be freezing in the mud. Of course, not everyone was so lucky. Poorly supplied units often made do with scraps. Some soldiers slept in brush shelters, basically piles of branches, or burrowed into the ground like animals. Others crowded into barns or abandoned houses, fighting off rats and the smell of manure. Winter was a cruel teacher, and those who couldn't build well often paid the price in sickness and misery. It wasn't just survival, though. Building shelters also gave soldiers something to do. Days spent sawing logs, stacking walls, and tinkering with chimneys kept boredom at bay. Men competed to see who could build the sturdiest or fanciest hut. It turned into a kind of morale booster, as well as a test of ingenuity. The shelters also created a sense of community. A row of huts became a neighborhood, with soldiers visiting each other, sharing fires, and swapping food. The cold forced men to work together, cutting wood, raising roofs, plastering mud. By the end, the camp wasn't just a collection of soldiers, it was a village of survivors. So, when you imagine a Civil War winter camp, don't just think of flimsy tents shivering in the snow. Picture huts with smoke curling from crooked chimneys. Picture dugouts glowing with firelight. Picture men laughing as they patch roofs, argue over chimney designs, or proudly show off their new log furniture. Survival demanded shelter, but ingenuity made it home, at least until spring came, and it was time to tear it all down. Because sometimes, enduring the cold wasn't just about holding out, it was about building something, no matter how rough, that reminded soldiers of home. Illness and medical struggles. If the cold didn't get you during a Civil War winter, sickness just might. Disease was the silent enemy that killed more soldiers than bullets or bayonets. And in those freezing camps, illness spread faster than rumors about the generals. The conditions were perfect for germs. You had thousands of men crammed together in huts or tents, breathing the same smoky air, sharing food and water, and not exactly bathing every day. Throw in poor nutrition, weak immune systems, and the general misery of winter, and you had a recipe for outbreaks. Coughs and colds were constant companions. Soldiers joked about camp cough, a hacking sound you could hear from one end of the camp to the other. But behind the humor was danger. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung infections turned common colds into deadly threats. A soldier who started with just a sniffle could be gone within weeks. Then there was dysentery, the polite word for relentless diarrhea. Winter didn't slow it down much. Contaminated water, dirty hands, and bad food kept it spreading. Soldiers described it as one of the worst torments of camp life. Imagine being freezing, weak, and having to run out into the snow in the middle of the night. It was miserable, and for many, fatal. Typhoid fever was another killer. Spread through contaminated water, it brought high fevers, stomach pain, and delirium. Entire camps were struck at once, leaving doctors overwhelmed. Malaria, smallpox, and measles also made their rounds. For young recruits who had never been exposed before, childhood diseases hit hard. Medical care didn't exactly inspire confidence. Army surgeons did their best, but they often lacked supplies, training, or even proper medicines. Quinine, used for malaria, was precious and often scarce. Pain relief was minimal opium, morphine, or just strong whiskey if you were lucky. For fevers, the cure might be a mix of rest, bleeding, and strange herbal concoctions that probably did more harm than good. Winter only made it harder. Medicines froze, wagons couldn't get through with supplies, and men were too weak to travel to hospitals. Camp hospitals were often just drafty tents or huts, smoky from fires, but still cold inside. Soldiers lay on straw pallets, coughing and moaning, with little more than a blanket for comfort. Nurses did what they could, but the sheer number of sick men was overwhelming. Yet even in this grim picture, there were moments of care and kindness. Fellow soldiers looked after each other, bringing water, adjusting blankets, or reading letters aloud. Chaplains and nurses moved from bed to bed, offering comfort when cures failed. In the darkest winters, this small human touch made all the difference. Prevention became its own form of survival. Officers tried to enforce cleanliness, ordering men to boil water or dig latrines far from camp. Some units kept stricter routines, washing hands, airing out blankets, or burning trash to keep disease at bay. It didn't always work, but any little bit helped. The toll was staggering. For every soldier killed in battle, roughly two died from disease. Winter magnified this reality, turning camps into breeding grounds of sickness. And yet, soldiers endured. They joked, they shared remedies, and they pressed on, knowing illness was just one more enemy they had to fight. So, when you picture Civil War soldiers battling the cold, don't just imagine them wrapped in blankets by a fire. Imagine the coughing, the fevers, the lines of men at makeshift hospitals. Imagine the struggle not just to stay warm, but to stay alive against invisible enemies. Because in many ways, surviving the winter meant surviving the illnesses that came with it. The cold was harsh, but disease was merciless. And yet, through care, camaraderie, and sheer stubborn will, countless soldiers managed to pull through. Hope and morale in winter in the Civil War was a strange test of spirit. Soldiers weren't clashing on battlefields every day, yet they still had to fight against cold, boredom, hunger, and sickness. What kept them going? Hope, morale, the belief that spring would eventually come, and with it, maybe even the end of the war. Morale was a fragile thing in those frozen camps. One day, spirits might soar because mail arrived with letters from home, or because someone's mother sent a box of cookies. The next day, a snowstorm could bury the camp, fires refused to light, and suddenly the whole army was grumbling. Hope flickered like a campfire, sometimes bright, sometimes smothered by smoke. For many soldiers, camaraderie kept morale alive. Friends became family, especially during winter. Men huddled together for warmth, shared food, and lifted each other's spirits with jokes or songs. A funny story told by the fire could chase away gloom better than any blanket. One soldier wrote that without his bunkmates, he would have gone stark mad during those long winter nights. Religion also played a powerful role. Prayer meetings, sermons, and hymn singing brought comfort. In the stillness of winter, men reflected on life and death more than ever. Chaplains reminded them that suffering had meaning, that bravery was rewarded, and that God watched over them. Even soldiers who weren't particularly religious often found peace in joining the gatherings. Hope came in the form of faith. Leaders knew morale mattered, too. Officers sometimes organized drills and parades just to break up monotony. Bands played music, flags were raised, and soldiers were reminded of the cause they were fighting for. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped men feel part of something larger than their own discomfort. Small victories in daily life boosted spirits. A successful hut-building project, a lively snowball fight, or even a good hot meal could turn moods around. Some soldiers took pride in making camp as comfortable as possible, stacking wood neatly, patching chimneys, or hanging up decorations carved from scraps. Turning a hut into a home gave men a sense of control over the uncontrollable. Of course, morale wasn't always high. Some soldiers sank into despair, dreaming only of home. Deserters slipped away in the night, unable to bear another week of freezing misery. Others turned to drinking or fighting to vent frustration. Winter tested every man's resilience, and not all passed the test. But even in the darkest times, sparks of hope showed up. A rumor that the war might soon end, a letter promising love and prayers from home, a sunrise over the frosty camp that reminded soldiers spring was coming. Hope didn't erase hardship, but it softened its edges. It's worth remembering that soldiers weren't superhuman. They felt fear, exhaustion, and loneliness just like anyone else. What made them endure was the little things, the bond of friendship, the comfort of faith, the joy of music, the taste of food from home. Morale wasn't a steady flame, but it was enough to keep them from freezing on the inside. So, when you think about Civil War soldiers in winter, don't just picture them as stoic statues of endurance. Picture them laughing with friends over a card game, singing hymns in smoky huts, or staring into the fire as they dreamed of going home. Picture them holding on to hope in the coldest nights, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to survive. Because in the end, winter wasn't just about battling the elements. It was about keeping spirits alive long enough to see spring. The thaw and moving forward winter in the Civil War always felt endless. The snow, the smoke-filled huts, the coughs echoing through camp days blurred together until it seemed spring might never arrive. But slowly, almost quietly, the world began to thaw. Snow turned to slush, rivers began to flow again, and the frozen ground softened under marching boots. Soldiers felt it in their bones. Winter was loosening its grip. The change brought relief, but also challenges. Huts that had felt snug in the cold quickly turned into damp, muddy traps once the ice melted. Chimneys collapsed, roofs leaked, and men found themselves ankle-deep in muck. Fires no longer roared cheerfully, they sputtered in the wet air. Still, even with the mess, there was joy in knowing the worst of the cold was behind them. Spring meant movement. Armies broke camp, leaving behind their smoky huts and makeshift villages. For many, it was bittersweet. Those rough shelters had been more than just walls and roofs. They'd been survival, creativity, and sometimes even comfort. Tearing them down felt like closing a chapter, but soldiers packed up their gear, tightened their belts, and prepared to march once again. With the thaw came fresh supplies. Roads cleared, wagons rolled, and food became a little easier to find. Soldiers traded hardtack for a fresher bread, salted pork for something closer to real meat. Spirits lifted. New uniforms, new shoes, and new letters from home gave men the sense that they were rejoining the world after months of isolation. But spring also meant fighting. Campaigns resumed as generals took advantage of better weather. The lull of winter was over. Battles loomed once more. Some soldiers welcomed it. Anything was better than endless boredom by a smoky fire. Others dreaded it, knowing the cannons and rifles would bring fresh suffering. Hope and fear mixed in equal measure as armies moved forward. Still, the endurance of winter mattered. Surviving the cold had forged resilience. Soldiers carried scars from frostbite, coughs from smoke, and memories of nights huddled in freezing huts. But they also carried lessons: how to improvise, how to lean on friends, and how to keep hope alive in the darkest season. These lessons followed them back into battle. For some, the thaw meant homecoming. Wounded or sick soldiers were sent back to recover. Others deserted, slipping away into the warming countryside. But for the majority, spring meant another march, another campaign, another year of war. Winter survival had been a battle of its own, and now a new chapter waited. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize soldiers braving the snow, but the truth is more complicated. They weren't heroes every day. They were ordinary men, forced to endure extraordinary hardship. They shivered, complained, laughed, and cried. They built huts out of logs and hope, fought off sickness with stubborn will, and clung to letters from home like lifelines. So when you picture the end of a Civil War winter, imagine soldiers standing in muddy camps, squinting at the sun breaking through the clouds. Imagine them stretching stiff limbs, breathing in the damp air, and feeling, maybe for the first time in months, that life could move forward again. Because surviving the winter wasn't just about fires and blankets, it was about endurance of the spirit. And when the thaw came, those who had endured carried with them not just the memory of suffering, but the strength that came from outlasting it.